Morning, everyone. My name's Kevin Scannell. I'm happy to be here. Can everybody hear me okay?
Well, I certainly can. Thank you so much, Kevin, for joining us. I know it is very small hours of the morning for you, so feels a little bit like a revision. Thank you for joining us on Irish time. So I'm going to do a very quick introduction and then we'll let Kevin be the star of the show. So Professor Kevin Scannell is Professor of Computer Science at St. Louis University. He's originally from Boston, of Irish heritage, and he started learning Irish in the 1990s. And as we say, I think the rest is history as regards that. And I think he's probably going to hint at the many and fantastic initiatives that he has been involved in, not only with Irish, but with many other Indigenous and minority languages, many of which are represented at the conference today, so including Scots Gaelic and Manx and other languages like that. So without further ado, I'm going to step quietly into the background and let Kevin take over. Thank you very much.
Great, thank you, Rebecca, and thanks for the invitation. It's a great honor to be here. I was in Ireland the last 6 months. I've just returned back to the U.S. I was living in Connemara for a stretch, hoping to do a lot of work on the Irish language and immerse myself in the language. Unfortunately, things didn't work out exactly the way I wanted to. Back home now. With the family and return back to teaching in the fall. But I wanted to talk a little bit about some of my work on Wikipedia specifically over the years. So I've done various other projects related to Irish and Manx and Scots Gaelic especially. But I thought it'd be good, given the audience, to focus on Wikipedia for a little bit. So, and again, given the audience, I won't spend a lot of time explaining why a Wikipedia high quality Wikipedia in a minority or indigenous language is so important. But for obvious reasons, having content in your native language, having a resource for students in immersion schools is very important. I did want to highlight one advantage of a Wikipedia that isn't always discussed, but I think is going to be one of the most important advantages of a high quality Wikipedia going forward. And that's the notion that people doing natural language processing, this is my field within computer science, and machine learning often use Wikipedia as training data for building language models and machine translation models and so on. And in fact, this has become the de facto standard when researchers are working. Typically what happens is they'll develop a model that works well on English. And if they want to scale that model up to be massively multilingual, the standard thing to do is to download all the text from, say, 100 Wikipedias and train models to do that. So if there are people who do natural language processing and you've heard of BERT or these other modern language models that have come out in the last few years, they're all trained on Wikipedia. And the issue is that the Irish Wikipedia is sort of a mixed bag. There's lots of very short stub articles and so on. There's some longer, better content as well. But I would say on the whole, it's probably not a good representative of Irish writing on the web, for example, or Irish writing generally. And therefore, the resources that you build using machine learning trained on something like the Irish Wikipedia aren't always reflective of the language more broadly. And that can be an issue. So again, this is, from my perspective, a long-term advantage of having a high-quality Wikipedia. So I want to talk about 3 ways that I've worked on scaling up the Irish Wikipedia over the years. One that's sort of old work, and then a couple that are planned work or underway. So the old work goes back to 2013, and this was a project that involved essentially importing or uploading an Irish language scientific encyclopedia called Fréamh an Eolas, written by Professor Matthew Hussey. This was a published book published by the Irish publisher Cushgane, several years before that. And what happened was that a friend of mine, Kieran Obertun, who's a supporter of open source software and open content, had a conversation with Professor Hussey and the publishers, and more or less convinced them of the value of essentially republishing the material on the Irish Wikipedia and essentially giving this book new life in a really impactful way. So it depended on that kind of personal connection of kind of explaining the issues. What does it mean to release your content with an open license? What are the upsides and the downsides, and so on? And this was a big, I don't want to call it Professor Hussey's life work. He's done lots of other things as well, but it was a massive undertaking that he did over many years to put that encyclopedia together. And it took some bravery really for him and the publisher to make that material available. But again, it depended on that personal connection to talk about the value of making this contribution. My own contribution was relatively small. I essentially took the raw proofs of the book and wikified them, meaning that things like mathematical formulas and so on had to be reformulated using wiki markup. The main issue was creating links in the text to other articles, which was tricky at a couple levels. I don't know if anybody's tried to do this with raw text, but there are issues with stemming words. So you typically want to link to the stemmed word as an article title, multi-word phrases, and as well as that some disambiguation. So you would have, a word like Neptune. There's an article for the planet and for the god as well. So there's some disambiguation work you have to do to get those links right. But in the end, the result was, I think, a great success. We ended up, at the time, just summer and fall of 2013, more than doubling the size of the Irish Wikipedia and adding, I believe, more than 7,000 new articles, all high quality content written by a fluent speaker who was a domain expert as well. I don't know if that approach to scaling up is repeatable. It's the only time we've succeeded in doing something on that scale. And I've heard stories of other language Wikipedias having some success with approaches like this, but I think there's a lot of value in sort of seeking out material like this from people who aren't necessarily technically oriented or interested in contributing directly to Wikipedia. The second thing I'd like to talk about, and my second so-called strategy for scaling up, is machine translation. Now, this is a standard approach. There's lots of translation that's going on in the Irish Wikipedia in particular, some of it done manually, others done with kind of Google Translate, and then some post-editing. So it's an approach that's very much in use right now, almost always articles from English. I should single out one particular Irish editor, Marcus O'Dinn, who's done incredible work over the last 2+ years, I think, adding articles to the Irish Wikipedia relating to Old Irish history, literature, mythology, and so on, and single-handedly has essentially fleshed out or filled in a huge gap in the Irish Wikipedia over the last couple of years. So I don't know if he's listening now, but the work he's done is incredible, and it was a huge gap. This was it was sort of much to our shame that those topics, which are fundamental to sort of Irish language and Gaelic culture over the last 1,000 years, were very well covered in the English Wikipedia, but virtually not at all in the Irish Wikipedia. So more or less his work involves translating those English articles. I think he does them manually. I don't think he uses MT. But my own research involves machine translation. So in part, So I'm interested in trying to apply this approach to translate between the Gaelic languages. So machine translation, I think probably everybody's used Google Translate. You're probably aware that it's sort of a mixed bag in terms of quality. It very much depends on the language pair, basically. When two languages are linguistically very close, the problem is easier. When, even if they're not linguistically close, if you have a lot of data in those languages, it can be quite easy. So Chinese and English machine translation's gotten very good over the last 5 or 10 years because there's a lot of parallel Chinese and English data. I've been working on the Gaelic languages, so Scottish, Manx, and Irish, and developed a machine translation engine about 5 years ago was when it started. In this case, I'm taking advantage of the fact that these three languages are linguistically very close to each other. There are some significant differences. In particular with Manx, there's a major difference in the orthography, but these things can be overcome. And on the downside, of course, is not very much data for these three languages and very little parallel data, by which I mean material that's been translated directly between those languages. There's some material like the Bible that's been kind of mutually translated from English or another language, which is useful, but not as useful as when you have material that's been directly translated from language A to language B. In any case, I developed this engine. I can try and do a little, I think I'll have time to do a quick demo here. So I'm gonna try and share my screen. We'll see how this goes. And I'll just show you the website where this thing lives. It's sort of a Google Translate-like interface. So give me a second. Everybody see that? Hopefully you can. So this is the Intergaelic website, intergaelic.com. And what I've done in advance here is I've pasted in a couple sentences from the Gaelic, Scottish Gaelic Wikipedia. And I will click translate, and this is all in Irish, but one of the nice things about this, so it's a Google Translate-like interface, except for the output. And the idea of the output here is that you get the source text back. So this is actually the Gaelic with the translation as annotations underneath. And again, I'm taking advantage of the fact that the language is very close and you often get kind of word by word correspondence. And the idea here is that the languages are so close that a good Irish speaker can read most of this without too much trouble, but there are a few words that are tricky. And if you need to peek at the machine translations, you can. And I think this is sort of a better approach when languages are really close to each other. All right. So hopefully I'm back. What I've done with Intergaelic is I've produced an open API. So developers can make calls to that API remotely, and various people have used this. So in particular, that Intergaelic website that you saw was developed by friend Michael Mikora, who's done a lot of work on Irish natural language processing and developed some of the major websites. So he was nice enough to develop that site based on the API. What I'd like to do, and I don't know if there are Wikimedia developers or engineers listening, but what I'd like to do is incorporate that API into Wikipedia Content Translation. I actually started some conversations, and I think there's even a fabricator bug somewhere where the work has has started on this. But I'd like to kind of push that through because I think there's a lot of potential for translating articles among the Gaelic languages, especially things related to local geography and kind of Gaelic content that might not be available on the English Wikipedia could be profitably translated among the Gaelic languages. so that's work to come. And again, this is sort of my second strategy for scaling up. And this one applies not only to Irish, but to the other Gaelic Wikipedias. I don't know how broadly applicable it is. Developing a machine translation engine was challenging and time consuming, but at least for the 3 Gaelic languages, I think it's a promising approach. I'd like to leave some time for questions. I'm gonna try and go through in maybe 5 more minutes the final topic, which is Wiki Data. So Wiki Data is a shared database. So there's going to be a lot of talk based on the schedule about Wiki Data over the conference. So I won't go into detail, but it's a massive open database that is used in various ways by Wikimedia to provide content, interwiki links, and so on for the various Wikipedias. I kind of fell in love with Wikidata about a year ago. When I started my sabbatical, I've been for a long time kind of planning on learning the Wikidata API and the kind of data model and so on. And it was one of the first things I did on my sabbatical. So a couple words first maybe about the Irish Wikipedia. There are a lot of stub articles. A lot of them relate to places in Ireland, species, various other things where it's maybe a sentence and sometimes an info box or something like that. The issue is that most of them are manually created, which is fine. I have no problem with stub articles. I think there's some value in them. But when they're manually created, they are often errors. There'd be misspellings in the place names, sort of a non-standard or incorrect place name, non-standard term for a particular species in Irish, and so on. The issue is that we have very good external databases, external to the Wikimedia projects for Irish. There's a terminology database, terma.ie. There's a database of place names, loganum.ie, and so on and so forth. And the hope is that by linking those external databases to the Wikipedia via Wiki Data, that we could, for example, automate stub article creation, and even not necessarily stubs, but sort of more fleshed out articles based on this very high quality content in such a way that it doesn't involve sort of the human in the loop to introduce errors and so on and so forth. So with this in mind, about a year ago, I wrote a bot and I started a project to clean up the place names on Irish Wikipedia, and in particular on Irish, on Wiki Data. So this involved essentially sort of linking items in Wiki Data, which would correspond to a particular place, townland or something in Ireland, with the corresponding entry in on the loganum database. In addition to that, it involved making sure that the name was correct, so that the official place name on loganum corresponded to the one that was in use on Wikidata and then the Irish Wikipedia. And in addition, Wikidata items all have descriptions in each language. It's possible to add them in each language, and I wanted to verify that those descriptions were correct as well. So I wrote a bot to do that. I didn't add wholesale items from loganum to Wikidata because the rights are a little bit unclear on that. But what I did was I took the items that already existed and made sure that they corresponded correctly to loganum items. More or less what happened is that, again, I kind of fell in love with Wikidata as a model and spent a lot of time over the last 12 months adding many labels and item descriptions in Irish to Wikidata. And I should check the number. As of this morning, I've added 4 million Irish language descriptions to Wikidata and 3 million new Irish language labels. to Wikidata over the last 12 months, or my bot has. These were added through a combination of manual translation. So I'm not machine translating anything. The idea is that you have the same English description of an item repeated thousands of times. You can manually translate that once, and then that scales up pretty quickly. And then some sort of templated translations. But then in addition, what's possible to do is to actually use the statements in a Wikidata item. So the actual things that describe what it is. This is a person who was born in this year, who had this job and was of this nationality, and automatically turn that into a description. I know various other languages have done this as well. I think the Dutch, Dutch descriptions being added is using a similar technique. But again, it's scaled up pretty well there. So that's 7,000 new strings added to Wikidata. And I have another 6 million queued up. My bot is I have only so much access to the server per second. So I'm hoping sometime in the 12 months that are coming that that work will be completed, and we'll have 13 million new strings added to Irish Wikidata. So I'm getting close to time here, so maybe just a word about what I'm hoping to do with this in the future. The idea, of course, Wikidata is great, and again, it serves the Wikipedias in various ways, but the end goal, of course, is to serve the end users of the content who are accessing things through Wikipedia. So part of this involves incorporating Wikidata through info boxes. And I think that's something that's hardly done at all on the Irish Wikipedia right now that we can really scale up and automate very easily. But then also essentially taking what I've done with Wikidata one step further, and instead of generating single sentence descriptions, generating entire articles. So this I think can be done pretty easily. I've seen a couple articles where people have looked at doing this with neural networks and various other approaches. I think it's something that can be profitably used to generate very high quality, I'll call them stub articles, because I'm not expecting to generate, multi-paragraph, well-referenced articles the way a human would. But what it could do potentially is replace some of the manual work that kind of an army of editors are doing on the Irish Wikipedia right now with a bot, therefore freeing those editors up, at least the ones who have a good Irish, freeing them up to compose their own articles and do research on their own articles, while if there are editors who aren't as comfortable with Irish, kind of freeing them up to do more maintenance work, adding images and links to other Wikipedias and so on and so forth. So I think there's real potential there. And looking forward to the future and seeing what the next 12 months bring. So I think that's probably a good place to stop. Thanks everyone for coming and listening.
Thank you very much, Kevin. That was absolutely fantastic. You managed to very eloquently cram an awful lot into the stuff that we gave you. So there's a few questions coming through, and I think primarily there's a lot of excitement because in the previous Celtic knots, specifically I think the one in Aberystwyth, there was a lot of jealousy, I think, from the Irish contingent about the ability for Welsh to leverage Wiki Data because they had an awful lot of their language, the tags have been translated and things like that. And at the time, obviously, we were quite hesitant to explore that with Wikipede because there is an awful lot already of English creep onto Wikipede at times, even just through the platform. So, there was obviously you don't want to be kind of shoehorning in possibly an awful lot more English language labels and that was the same with the info boxes. But of course, and the question came through yesterday on Twitter from Jason about how suddenly Ireland or the Irish language went from overtook Welsh in the amount of translated labels we had. So it's fantastic that we can thank you in person, and I think there's a lot of people really excited about that. There's interest if you take a look at the Etherpad later on. There's people who are involved in lexemes on on Wiki Data who'd be really interested in talking to you and regards their project. The main question that's coming through is so to have the name of the translation platform that you demonstrated, if you can.
Yeah, so Intergaelic, intergaelic.com. Yeah, that should be easy to find if you Google Intergaelic, for example. Yeah,
and that's the name on Fabricator, because we have one or two people on Fabricator taking a look to see whether that.
Oh yeah, it may have had a slightly different name. It may have been called Kaijon at the time, which I can't remember now. It was 2017 that the bugs came out, and those discussions were underway. I think it stalled a little bit because of the sort of strange way that I do things, which I think is a better way with this kind of manual alignment, word by word or phrase by phrase. So it's the output of the API is sort of richer than what Google Translate's API would give you, because it's giving you actual alignments between the source and the target words. So I think that may have caused some of the holdup, but I'm excited to get that back on track. I think there's a lot of potential there.
I presume, there's kind of some questions coming through about kind of the types of, I suppose, platforms that you use for machine translation, and that in the last while we now have Google Translate for our translate tool on between wikis, but for Irish in particular, it's not ideal. It's not the, as you say, it's not the most adept, or it's quite a, I wouldn't say poor quality, but it's not anywhere near the quality of written by a person. Would you kind of hope that in the future that perhaps something a little bit richer, like you're developing, will make its way into that platform, and perhaps have a link to some of the data that's coming through on Wiki Data to kind of bolster it a little bit? Or how would you kind of hope that those kind of on-wiki tools would be developed in the future?
Well, Google Translate's improved a lot, I'll say, even over the last 3 years. It's still better into English than it is out of English, I think, in my opinion. So it's and that's just a factor of the way machine translation works, more or less. So I think we have a ways to go before heavy post editing is no longer needed. I'll put it that way. I think post editing is always going to be needed, but at present, for me personally, it's easier for me to translate things from scratch. And I know that's true for a lot of people. Again, I think Marcus, who I mentioned, I'm pretty sure translates from scratch, because I think he pastes in the English first, and then we'll work on it from there. Yeah, there aren't too many. I know there are other machine translation engines out there. It's a very difficult space to compete in, to be honest. Things move so fast, and there's a lot of money poured into it, and the models now require supercomputers or clusters of computers to train effectively. So it's expensive to develop. I think you have to find a niche, the way I did with particular language pairs, where you have some sort of competitive advantage over Google Translate to get real bang for the buck out of working on it. But it may be that 5 years from now, Google Translate's caught up to what I'm doing. It's hard to say. I think we can always win by having better data. Google's not going to have the kind of linguistic knowledge and the data that the people in the community have necessarily, and that's a big advantage for us.
It was really interesting to hear about the work that you did with Hussey to bring in high quality content. And as you say, that a lot of that's down to, and I've discovered this a little bit, speaking with people in Shanglin, and that it really is very much based on those kind of personal relationships and kind of people knowing, putting face to the name and things like that. Do you think that there's an appetite? Could something like that happen again, or do you think that it was really kind of a once-off, or kind of an unusual project in of itself?
I think it can happen again. I think there are various projects out there that have potential, and what I'll say at this point, without kind of sort of exposing any discussions I've had, is that there is a culture, I think, of a real culture of openness among people working with the Irish language very broadly. That refers to software developers and people doing NLP kinds of things like me. There are groups doing this at DCU and NUIG and Trinity and so on. And for the most part, people are sharing their resources, sharing their software, sharing their data, and so on. And I think that sort of has leaked into other areas as well. So LogAnim, I mentioned, this amazing database is available under an open license. So the question and what I was sort of hinting at is it's not clear whether that license is compatible with the open licenses on Wikimedia projects. So that's some discussions that have to be had. But I think the people's heart is in the right place. That they want to make this data available for people to use in interesting ways. I think it's possible to do that in such a way that sort of LogAnim maintains its place as sort of the central repository for high quality, I'm having trouble translating into English, place names, place name information, while still making some of that data available through Wikimedia projects.
Yeah, I think that the worry is always that they'll kind of get subsumed.
Sure.
Yeah, and Fiontar in DCU kind of had a feeling that I was like, well, if you do that, then what's our place in the universe? And I think explaining the linked nature of Wiki Data very much kind of alleviates an awful lot of those worries. There's a very lively note-taking and question and answering happening, people answering each other's questions in the Etherpad, if you want to take a look at that in a few hours, Kevin, perhaps when dawn breaks for you, you've had time to refresh. But I will leave you just on the note that Galder from Basque Wikipedia has just created a stub about Pierce Beasley on Basque Wikipedia, he's the featured article at the moment on Wikipage. So very happy to see him
very good.
Make his way onto another Wikipedia. It'll make a lot of people very happy. But a huge thank you, Kevin. Thank you so much for taking the time to join us. I know there's a lot of people very excited to see you speak here. Bit of a, as somebody said, a living legend, bit of a superstar in the Irish technology and Irish language space. So it was absolutely wonderful that you could share your expertise with us, and we all really enjoyed it. And I think it sets a fantastic tone for the next 2 days. So I think on that note, we will bid you adieu until we come back in about, I think 90 minutes. We'll come back after a break, our lunch break, and we will join you again. So thank you again, Gurmi Loggett, Kevin Weaving.
Slán.